Most people think they know how the Spanish conquered the Americas. The story has been told so many times in so many classrooms and documentaries and adventure films that it's practically hardened into legend. A handful of Spanish soldiers, maybe 500 men, step off their ships onto a strange new shore. They're outnumbered by hundreds of thousands, surrounded by empires far larger and older than anything back home. But they have steel swords and horses and guns and armor and an unshakable belief that God is on their side. And somehow, against impossible odds, this tiny band of adventurers marches into the heart of two of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, and brings them both crashing down in a matter of years. Guns, germs, and steel, God, gold, and glory. A few brave, ruthless men and their superior technology conquering a continent. It's a thrilling story. It's the kind of story that makes for great cinema. And it is, in almost every important respect, wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the events didn't happen. Hernan Cortes was real. Francisco Pizarro was real. Tenochtitlan fell. Atahualpa was strangled. The empires did collapse, and the consequences were catastrophic and world-altering. But the explanation, the story we tell ourselves about why it happened, the version that puts a few hundred Europeans at the center and treats everyone else as scenery, is a myth. And it's not a harmless one. Because when you actually dig into the historical record, when you read the indigenous accounts alongside the Spanish ones, when you follow the alliances and the disease and the money and the politics, you discover that the conquest of the Americas was not the triumph of a small band of supermen. It was something far stranger, far more complicated, and in many ways far more disturbing. It was a story in which the Spanish were often not the main characters at all. So let me take you back and tell you the version that historians have been quietly assembling for the last several decades. The version that most of us were never taught. The version that changes not just how you understand one of the most consequential events in human history, but how you understand the way history itself gets written by the winners and remembered by everyone else. Let's start by dismantling the single most powerful myth of all, the myth of the tiny band of conquerors. When Cortes landed on the coast of what is now Mexico in 1519, he did have a small force, somewhere around 500 or 600 Spaniards, 16 horses, a few cannon. That part is true. If you froze the story right there on the beach, the numbers really would look impossible. Ahead of him lay the Aztec Empire, more properly called the Mexica, a civilization of millions of people, with a capital city, Tenochtitlan, that was larger than almost any city in Europe, built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected by causeways, fed by floating gardens, home to perhaps 200,000 people. When the Spanish first saw it, some of them wondered aloud whether they were dreaming. This was not a primitive society waiting to be overrun. This was an urban, literate, mathematically sophisticated empire that in many ways outclassed the cities the conquistadors had come from. So how does a few hundred men topple that? The old answer is technology and boldness. And here's the thing you have to understand. That answer was essentially invented by the conquerors themselves. Cortes wrote long letters back to the Spanish king, and in those letters he made himself the hero of an almost supernatural adventure. Later Spanish chroniclers polished the story further, and European and American historians for centuries afterward repeated it, because it flattered a particular idea. The idea that a small number of Europeans, by virtue of their civilization and their faith and their gunpowder, were simply destined to rule. The historian Matthew Restall, in his landmark book 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, calls this exactly what it is, a myth. And when you strip it away, the real story emerges. Because Cortes did not conquer the Aztec Empire with 500 men. He conquered it to the extent that he conquered it at all, with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors fighting alongside him. By the time of the final siege of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish were a small minority in their own army. The historian Ross Hassig has estimated that as many as 200,000 native allies took part in that final campaign. 200,000 against a few hundred Spaniards who, in that context, functioned less like an invading army and more like a specialized mercenary unit, a source of certain useful technologies, and a convenient outside catalyst. So who were these allies, and why on earth would they fight to bring down their own neighbors? To answer that, you have to understand what the Aztec Empire actually was. We tend to imagine it as a unified nation, like modern Mexico with feathers. It was nothing of the kind. It was a tribute empire. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan, together with two allied cities, had built their power by conquering and dominating dozens of other city-states across central Mexico and forcing them to pay tribute. Goods, labor, and, most notoriously, human beings for religious sacrifice. Many of these subject peoples hated their overlords with a passion that had been building for generations. To them, the Mexica were not their nation. They were their oppressors. And there was one people in particular who had never submitted at all, the Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcala was a confederation of city-states surrounded on nearly every side by Aztec-controlled territory, an independent island in a hostile sea. For decades, they had been locked in ritualized, grinding warfare with the Mexica, the so-called Flower Wars, partly fought to capture prisoners for sacrifice. The Tlaxcalans lived under constant blockade, cut off from salt, from cotton, from trade, slowly being strangled by the empire next door. They were desperate for a way to break the Mexica grip. And then, out of the sea, came these strange bearded men with horses and steel and a burning ambition to reach Tenochtitlan. Now, the Tlaxcalans didn't simply welcome the Spanish with open arms. First, they fought them hard. The battles were brutal, and the Spanish very nearly didn't survive the encounter. But the Tlaxcalan leadership, watching these newcomers fight, made a calculation. Here was a wild card, a foreign force with useful weapons, and, more importantly, an obvious hatred of the Mexica. Here was a tool. So the Tlaxcalans struck an alliance, not out of naivety, not because they were dazzled by European superiority, but out of cold, rational, strategic self-interest. They would use the Spanish to destroy the empire that had tormented them for a century. This is one of the great reversals of the whole story. For centuries, the popular version had the Spanish cleverly manipulating gullible natives. But look closely, and you can just as easily read it the other way. The Tlaxcalans and other groups like them were using the Spanish, folding this small foreign force into their own long-running war against Tenochtitlan. What we call the Spanish conquest of Mexico was, from the perspective of the people who did most of the actual fighting, a regional war of liberation and revenge, an indigenous civil conflict in which the Europeans were junior partners. There's even a surviving Nahuatl language song about the war that treats it almost entirely as a struggle between rival native cities, with the Spanish as a minor detail. That's how central the Europeans really were to the people living it. Which brings us to a figure the traditional story almost always shoves into the background, when she may be one of the single most important individuals in the entire conquest. A woman known to history by many names: Malintzin, Doña Marina, La Malinche. She was born a Nahua noblewoman somewhere on the Gulf Coast, and as a girl she was sold or given away into slavery, torn from her family. By the time she was handed over to the Spanish, she had lived among different peoples and spoke at least two indigenous languages: Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and a Maya tongue. Cortes had a Spaniard, Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked and learned Maya. So a chain formed. Cortes spoke Spanish to Aguilar, Aguilar spoke Maya to Malintzin, and Malintzin spoke Nahuatl to the peoples of central Mexico. And she was brilliant. She learned Spanish quickly, cutting out the middleman, becoming Cortes's direct voice, his interpreter, his cultural guide, his diplomatic strategist. When the Spanish negotiated the alliance with Tlaxcala, when they navigated the shifting politics of a dozen city-states, when they understood who hated whom and where the fault lines ran, it was very often because Malintzin made it possible. One of the Spanish soldiers who was actually there, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, wrote decades later that without her, they could not have understood the land at all. Think about what that means. The conquest ran on communication, on diplomacy, on reading a political landscape the Spanish barely comprehended. And the person doing that work, standing at the very center of the encounter, was an enslaved indigenous woman. In Mexico, her legacy is bitterly contested to this day. Some see her as a traitor, some as a victim, some as the symbolic mother of a whole new people. But whatever else she was not scenery. She was arguably indispensable. And the traditional story obsessed with Cortes could barely bring itself to mention her. So already the myth is falling apart. The tiny band was actually a massive coalition. The clever Europeans were, in a sense, being used by their allies. And the conquest depended on the mind of an enslaved woman that most textbooks reduce to a footnote. But there is one more force in this story, and it may have been the most decisive of all. It was invisible, it was silent, and it killed on a scale that no army in human history has ever matched. Disease. When the Spanish first entered Tenochtitlan, they were received tensely by the Emperor Moctezuma. What followed was a period of hostage-taking, rising tension, and eventually open war. And in the middle of it, in 1520, the Spanish were actually driven out of the city in a bloody nighttime retreat the Spanish would remember as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, in which much of Cortes's force was killed. By any military logic, that should have been the end. The Spanish were battered, surrounded, deep in hostile territory. The Mexica had won, and then smallpox arrived. The virus had come across the ocean in European bodies, and it found a population that had never encountered it before, with no immunity whatsoever. The historian Alfred Crosby called these virgin soil epidemics, and the phrase captures the horror of it. In Europe, smallpox was a childhood disease that killed some and spared many. In the Americas, it swept through entire communities and killed with a speed and totality that survivors could barely describe. It burned through Tenochtitlan during the very months the city needed all its strength. It killed warriors, priests, farmers, families, and critically, it killed the emperor who had just defeated the Spanish, Cuitlahuac, the leader who had driven Cortes out. An indigenous account, written down later, described bodies so thick in the streets that people could not walk without stepping on the dead. Now understand what this did to the balance of the war. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies had time to regroup, to build ships to attack the island city, to gather even more allies. And their enemy, the great city of Tenochtitlan, was being hollowed out from the inside by a plague it could not fight, could not understand, and could not stop. When the final siege came in 1521 and the city fell after months of desperate resistance, its last emperor Cuauhtémoc captured. It fell as much to a virus as to any sword. The conquest of the Mexica was not really a demonstration of European military genius. It was a coalition of vengeful indigenous nations, guided by an enslaved interpreter, exploiting an empire that was simultaneously being annihilated by a disease no one on earth yet understood. And this pattern, this exact pattern, was about to repeat itself 1,000 miles to the south, in the mountains of the Andes, in a story that makes the role of disease in politics even more undeniable. Because in Peru, the plague didn't just help the invaders, it arrived before them. The Inca Empire was, by some measures, even more impressive than the Aztec. It stretched for thousands of miles along the spine of South America, bound together by an astonishing network of roads and storehouses and relay runners administered without money or writing as we understand it, feeding millions of people. It was the largest empire the Americas had ever produced, and when Francisco Pizarro arrived to challenge it in 1532, he brought a force that made Cortes's little band look enormous by comparison. 168 men, 60-something horses, that's it. 168 men against an empire of perhaps 10 million. If the tiny band myth were true anywhere, surely it would have to be true here. And yet what actually happened is that the empire was already tearing itself apart before Pizarro ever set foot in the highlands. And the reason, once again, was disease. Years earlier, before any Spaniard had reached Inca territory, smallpox had come racing down through the Americas along indigenous trade and travel routes, moving faster than the Europeans themselves. It reached the Andes, and it killed the reigning Inca emperor Huayna Capac sometime in the mid-1520s. And it didn't stop there. It also killed the heir he had chosen. In a single stroke, the disease decapitated the empire and left the succession unresolved. Two of the emperor's sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar, went to war over the throne. And this was not a minor squabble. It was a devastating, years-long civil war that split the empire in half, pitted army against army, and left a trail of massacres and burned loyalties across the Andes. By the time Pizarro marched inland, Atahualpa had just defeated and captured his brother. He had won, but the empire was raw, divided, full of regions and peoples who had backed the losing side and now feared the victor. There were whole populations who saw the arrival of these strangers not as an invasion, but as a possible opportunity, exactly as the Tlaxcalans had in Mexico. Pizarro's tiny force could never have beaten a unified Inca empire at the height of its power, but that empire no longer existed. What Pizarro found was a wounded, fractured state, its leadership freshly traumatized, its people exhausted, its emperor distracted by a war he had only just barely won. And Pizarro did something audacious and appalling. When he finally met Atahualpa at the town of Cajamarca in November of 1532, the emperor came with a huge retinue, thousands strong but largely unarmed, treating the meeting as a matter of ceremony. He had no reason to fear a couple hundred travel-worn foreigners. Pizarro sprang a trap. His men, hidden in the buildings around the square, opened fire and charged. In the chaos and slaughter that followed, they seized the emperor himself, the living god of the Inca world, held prisoner by a band of strangers. What followed is one of the most infamous episodes in the whole story. Atahualpa, understanding that these men were obsessed with precious metal, offered a ransom almost beyond comprehension, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver. The Inca gathered it, stripping temples and palaces across the empire, and delivered it. And the Spanish took it, melted it into bars, and then executed him anyway, in 1533, strangling the emperor they had promised to free. Even with him dead, the conquest of Peru was far from over. It would take decades of further fighting, and Inca resistance would hold out in the mountain refuge of Vilcabamba until 1572. But the pattern is unmistakable. Once again, a tiny European force succeeded not through raw superiority, but by exploiting an empire that disease and civil war had already brought to its knees. So if the real engines of the conquest were disease, indigenous alliances, and political fracture, we're left with a question the heroic myth never bothers to ask honestly. Why were the Spanish there at all? And why were they willing to do such things? And this is where you have to follow the money and follow the ideas, because the conquest was not just a military event. It was an economic project and a religious mission fused together, and understanding that fusion explains almost everything about what came next. Start with where the conquistadors came from. In 1492, the very year Columbus sailed, Spain completed something it had been pursuing for nearly 8 centuries. The Reconquista, the long Christian campaign to take back the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, finally ended with the fall of Granada. Think about what that meant for Spanish society. For generations, war against non-Christians had been the path to land, to status, to glory, to salvation. It had produced a whole class of men, minor nobles and soldiers and adventurers, whose entire identity was built around conquest as a holy and profitable enterprise. And now, suddenly, that war was over. The frontier was gone. All that ambition and violence had nowhere to go. And then, across the ocean, a new frontier appeared. The men who sailed to the Americas were, in a very real sense, the Reconquista, looking for a new target. They brought its logic with them, the fusion of faith and plunder, the conviction that conquering non-Christians and seizing their wealth was not just permitted but righteous, The conquistadors were not agents of the Spanish state in any modern sense. Most of them were private adventurers, financing their own expeditions, gambling their lives on the chance of striking it rich. Cortes defied his own governor to march inland. Pizarro was an aging, illiterate soldier chasing one last impossible fortune. These were not employees. They were entrepreneurs of violence, and the American empires were their venture capital. So what did they build once the fighting was, for the moment, done? They built a machine for extracting labor and wealth, and it had a name, the encomienda. On paper, an encomienda was a grant that gave a Spanish colonist the right to demand labor and tribute from a group of indigenous people in exchange for supposedly protecting them and instructing them in Christianity. In practice, it was a system of forced labor that treated the surviving native population as a resource to be used up. And used up is the right phrase because the demographic catastrophe that had helped the Spanish win the war kept right on going after the war was over. Wave after wave of disease combined with brutal labor and social collapse produced one of the largest population declines in all of human history. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in your mind. Serious estimates suggest that the indigenous population of the Americas fell from something like 60 million people before contact to perhaps 6 million a century and a half later, a decline on the order of 90%. Entire peoples, entire languages, entire ways of understanding the world simply erased. This is sometimes called the Great Dying, and it is very likely the largest demographic disaster in recorded human history. It was not a single event, and it was not, for the most part, a deliberate campaign of extermination. It was the compounding horror of disease meeting a population with no immunity, layered on top of war, enslavement, starvation, and the shattering of societies. But its scale is the essential fact that the adventure story version of the Conquest tends to whisper, if it mentions it at all. And here is where the economics turns truly global, because as the indigenous population collapsed, the Spanish still wanted labor, and above all, they wanted one thing: silver. In the 1540s, prospectors found it in staggering quantities at a mountain in what is now Bolivia. The Spanish called it Cerro Rico, the rich hill, and the city that grew at its base, Potosi, became one of the largest and highest cities on earth, a boomtown at nearly 14,000 feet, swallowing human lives to feed a global appetite for money. More silver was found at Zacatecas in Mexico, and the Spanish crown took its cut of all of it, the famous royal fifth, 20% of every ounce. The scale of what came out of those mountains reshaped the entire planet. Spanish-American silver, minted into coins known as pieces of 8, became something the world had never seen before, a truly global currency. It flowed east across the Atlantic to Europe, where it funded Spain's endless wars and, ironically, often passed straight through Spanish hands into the accounts of foreign bankers to whom the crown was perpetually in debt. And it flowed west across the Pacific all the way to China, whose enormous economy had an almost bottomless demand for silver. For the first time in history, a mine in the Andes was directly connected to a market in Asia. The conquest of the Americas didn't just topple two empires. It laid the financial foundation of the modern global economy, and it did so on the backs of forced laborers, indigenous workers drafted through a rotational labor system called the Mita, and increasingly enslaved Africans, hundreds of thousands of whom were shipped across the ocean to replace the native populations that were dying out. The wealth of the New World was extracted, quite literally, from human bodies. And this raises the moral question that haunts the entire episode. And that leads us into the last great thing the popular story gets wrong. Because we tend to imagine that everyone back in Spain simply cheered all of this on, that the cruelty was universal and unquestioned. It wasn't. From very early on, there were Spaniards, especially certain friars, who looked at what was being done in the Americas and were horrified. And they started to argue loudly in ways that would eventually shape international law itself. The most famous of them was a man named Bartolomé de las Casas. He had actually been an encomendero himself, had held indigenous people in forced labor, and then underwent a profound crisis of conscience and spent the rest of his long life fighting against the system he had once profited from. He wrote searing accounts of the atrocities committed against native peoples, documenting massacres and enslavement in unflinching detail, and he lobbied the crown relentlessly. And remarkably, he got results. His campaigning helped produce the new laws of 1542, which tried, with limited success, to rein in the encomienda system. It contributed to a papal declaration that indigenous people were fully rational human beings with souls and rights who could not simply be enslaved at will. And in 1550 and 1551, the Spanish crown did something almost unheard of for an empire in the middle of a conquest. It ordered a formal debate about whether the conquest itself was just. At Valladolid, Las Casas argued against a scholar named Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who defended the conquest and argued that indigenous people were natural inferiors who benefited from Spanish rule. The debate settled nothing cleanly, and the exploitation continued for centuries regardless. But the very fact that it happened, that an empire paused to argue with itself about the morality of what it was doing, is historically extraordinary, and it complicates any simple picture of a uniformly monstrous Spain. But here we have to be careful, because this is where the pendulum can swing too far in the other direction. Las Casas's vivid accounts of Spanish cruelty were seized upon by Spain's rival powers, the English, the Dutch, the French, who were only too happy to paint Spain as uniquely, cartoonishly evil, a nation of bloodthirsty fanatics, while conveniently ignoring their own colonial atrocities. This propaganda hardened into what historians call the Black Legend, the idea that the Spanish were somehow in a category of villainy all their own. And the truth is that the Black Legend was often less about genuine concern for indigenous people and more about one set of colonizers scoring points against another. Every European power that reached the Americas brought disease, dispossession, and violence. Spain was neither uniquely wicked nor, as its defenders sometimes claim in response, some misunderstood force of enlightenment. It was a colonial empire doing what colonial empires did, sometimes with more legal hand-wringing than its rivals, and sometimes with astonishing brutality. So let's pull all of this together, because when you step back, the real shape of the story becomes clear, and it looks almost nothing like the myth we started with. The conquest of the Americas was not the victory of a few hundred Europeans over millions through sheer courage and superior gadgets. It was the collision of several enormous forces that happened to converge at the same moment. There was disease, the invisible catastrophe that killed on a scale no army ever could, that emptied cities and toppled emperors and broke the will of nations before the fighting even started. There was politics, the deep internal fractures within the Aztec and Inca empires, the resentments of subject peoples, the civil wars over succession, which meant that the Spanish were almost never fighting a united enemy and were often just one faction in someone else's war. There were the indigenous allies, hundreds of thousands of them, who did the overwhelming majority of the fighting and made the conquest possible, pursuing their own goals for their own reasons. There were the intermediaries, people like Melinsen, whose knowledge and language and diplomacy bridged worlds that the Spanish alone could never have crossed. And underneath it all, there was the economic and religious engine, the Reconquista's warrior culture looking for new conquests, the hunger for gold and silver, the machinery of forced labor, and the ideology that dressed plunder in the robes of salvation. And here's the thing about the conquest that the word conquest itself hides. It was never really finished, and it was never total. We say the Spanish conquered the Americas as though it were a single, clean event, a curtain falling in 1521 or 1533. But large parts of the Americas resisted for centuries. The Maya of the Yucatan were never fully subdued in the initial waves at all, and their last independent kingdom held out until 1697, more than 170 years after Cortes. In the south of Chile, the Mapuche people fought the Spanish and then the states that followed them for roughly 300 years, maintaining their independence across generations. The neat map of a conquered continent is another comforting fiction. The reality was a slow, uneven, violent, endlessly contested process that in many places never really ended, and whose consequences are still being lived out today. So why does all this matter? Why should we care whether the story we tell about 500-year-old events is accurate or mythologized? It matters because myths are never neutral. The heroic version of the conquest, the version with the brave little band of Europeans and their unstoppable technology, was not an innocent mistake. It was a story that served a purpose. It made conquest look like destiny. It made European domination look like the natural order of things, the inevitable result of superior people meeting inferior ones. It erased the indigenous peoples who fought, who allied, who negotiated, who resisted, who survived, turning them from actors in their own history into a passive backdrop for someone else's adventure. And it quietly excused the horror, the enslavement, and the extraction and the millions of dead by wrapping it in the language of glory and progress. When you believe that history is made by a few great men with superior tools, you stop asking about everyone else. You stop asking about the enslaved interpreter, the Tlaxcalan warrior, the miner in Potosi, the emperor dying of a disease he had no name for. The true origin of the Spanish conquest is not a story about the triumph of a superior civilization. It's a story about contingency, about disease and politics and money and luck all colliding at a particular moment in a way that no one, least of all the conquistadors, fully understood or controlled. It's a story in which the Europeans were often bit players in dramas that were not about them, riding a wave of catastrophe they did not create and could not have imagined. And it's a story whose real protagonists, the indigenous peoples of the Americas and all their diversity and agency and suffering and endurance, were written out of their own history for 500 years and are only now being written back in. That's what historians get wrong, or rather what the popular story we inherited gets wrong, and what serious historians have spent decades trying to correct. Not the facts of who did what to whom. Those are mostly settled. What the myth gets wrong is the meaning. It tells us that the powerful win because they deserve to, that history flows in one inevitable direction, that some peoples are actors and others are scenery, and every one of those lessons is false and dangerous and still with us. The next time you hear the story of a few brave conquistadors toppling mighty empires against impossible odds, remember what's really underneath it. Remember the 200,000 allies. Remember the silent plague that did more killing than any sword. Remember the empire tearing itself apart in civil war before the invaders even arrived. Remember the enslaved woman standing between two worlds making the whole thing possible. Remember Potosi and the bodies it consumed and the global economy it helped build. And remember that the story of the conquest, like almost every story of the powerful conquering the vulnerable, was written to make the outcome seem inevitable and the cost seem worth it. It was neither. History is not a morality play with heroes and villains and a satisfying ending. It is a tangle of forces, most of them invisible to the people caught inside them. And the closer you look at the true origin of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the more you realize that almost everything you were taught to admire about it was really something you should have been taught to question. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these kinds of long-form, carefully researched stories. And if you have your own perspective on how the conquest really unfolded, drop it in the comments. I read them all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.